Hey, this is David Rovix hosting another live stream broadcast, which is appearing on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, KBOO, Community Radio, and various other platforms. During the pandemic, since I can no longer tour and play music for a living, I've taken to interviewing people of interest most weekdays at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT, and doing a house concert from my living room on the last Saturday of every month at 1 p.m. Pacific, along with various other live streaming activities. Every Tuesday, the broadcast has an actual producer, longtime Detroit area talk show host, and Fifth Estate magazine editorial collective member Peter Werby. These days, Fifth Estate is a quarterly print magazine that has been published in one form or another since its founding in 1965. The summer issue is hot off the presses. You can subscribe to it at fifthestate.org and hear previous episodes of Fifth Estate Live there as well. Today's guest, Taylor Roseweeds, is a former radio personality and current podcast host and writer living and working in rural Eastern Washington. Her show Praxis ran from 2012 to 2019 and focused on radical politics through in-depth interviews with activists, academics, artists, and anyone working for transformative social change with an emphasis on their methods over their ideas. She's now working on a book featuring some of the lessons from this collection of over 300 interviews, a new podcast project which revisits interviews with radicals across the country taken in the summer of 2015, and toward publishing a full archive of the original broadcast episodes. She has published poetry and prose alike as a regular columnist for The Inlander in Spokane, Washington, and has written for Fifth Estate on the DIY ethic as part of anarchist politics and on Palestinian human rights. Taylor Roseweeds, welcome to Fifth Estate Live.
Hi.
Your bio that you wrote was just so well written. I just had to use it like that. I usually rewrite them, and but that was yeah.
You got to make up one thing, add like a little.
Yeah, add some details that aren't real.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being on the show. And I was, so much of your writing, your own poetry, which is you've written some beautiful stuff, and a lot of it is about Spokane, and sort of so much of it is really centered in Spokane, which is, I think, wonderful because it just, I don't know how much poetry has been written about Spokane. I mean, I might have missed that. But
Yeah, it's not a famously inspiring place for those who have been there. That's funny. I think that must be what's online right now, what's out there.
Yeah, quite like, because most of it actually, I mean, that's another thing I was going to ask you about too, is most of it is not online, and that is intentional on your part, just making it only available in print?
No, actually, it's mostly a function of having just redone my website and just slowly putting things up. So my first book, my first poetry collection is all kind of climate change, end of the world stuff, which makes it sound really light and fun. But that PDF is up there. So that isn't place specific. It's more just kind of, I wrote that in 2015, 2014, and it's kind of just like processing. What are we going to do?
But out here in the West, there is a sort of apocalyptic quality to life in the summer times, right? I mean, it's like kind of the whole reality of climate change is pretty stark when you completely run out of water and everything starts burning, right? Which has been happening out there quite a bit as well as over.
Yeah, and it's become so normalized too. I think that's part of it that's really hard is the fires, for people who are listening who aren't in the West, it's just become like, this is a novel August where I'm living now, which is not in Spokane, but kind of in the general constellation where we've been able to see the sky every day. It hasn't been this like smoky mask wearing, a lot of us already had N95 masks because this has just become smoke season, but so many people are like, oh yeah, it's fire season. It's like, no, that wasn't a season. When
I don't know how near you,
very long ago.
How near are you to Twisp? Are you anywhere out in that area of Eastern Washington?
But my folks are from up that way, so I have family in Okanagan County, and they're sending me pictures of like across the valley. Here's flames. So I mean, it's definitely just been part of the backdrop of all of our lives. No. So.
And then having a pandemic and having the West on fire while the East is underwater, it's a particular combination that evokes biblical imagery.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I'm really I don't know, I've been thinking about that just, like, as someone kinda in the media sphere, just the headline, like, "Pandemic fueled prison labor firefighter shortage," like
I know. What a headline. I mean, if you came from the future and you saw that headline, like, it's one of those, like, could you even make sense of it at all?
yeah, exactly. So, it's just a strange time to be I've listened to some of your other interviews you've done on this, and I think everyone can agree, like, yeah, it's an
Strange.
escalated time. So,
But all this, all the contradictions that are coming to the fore because of the pandemic and the government response to it, and all the vast inequities in society, and I mean that's really been quite something to see. And then the rising of this social movement. What's going on around your neck of the woods? I mean, because it often gets, it's all often painted in the mainstream media as like there's the progressives in the cities, and then there's the people in the countryside who are all Trump supporters, which is a ridiculous oversimplification. But
it is. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because with the quarantine so I have a chronic illness and a compromised immune system, so I've been very much inside, which is conducive to working on a book, but since March, and, moved out of town, out of Spokane at the end of May. So I'm brand new in a very small town, which is lovely, and people are great. It's about 900 people. It's a farming community. It's not dissimilar from the places where both of my parents grew up, but it's definitely smaller than Spokane. And at the same time, Spokane is not Seattle or Portland by any stretch of the imagination. It's very conservative. It's smaller. It's really just kind of like dominated by traditional values. And but right when at the beginning of June, when the protests for George Floyd were kicking off, I had moved my roommate down that weekend, and we were watching the Facebook Live of people in downtown Spokane, where I've been attending and organizing protests for almost 15 years, getting tear gassed and getting shot with rubber bullets and having like street combat in that town, which was really it was odd to see. It felt weird to be watching it on Facebook Live,
not being
like
there.
mediated and being like, oh, I think that's someone I know.
Hmm.
Their face shouldn't be on there, and just seeing how that, like, I think the game has really changed in that little towns like Kenosha right now in Wisconsin,
Hmm.
like just today and yesterday with the shooting of Jake Blake. Um, it's just changed. And so the town I'm in now is very small, and I'm not looking to roll in and be super involved because this is a place where it's like generational families and deep relationships, and
You don't just hit the ground running in a
you
town
don't.
like that.
But there has been a really interesting like public conflict over flying Blue Lives Matter flags and having Black Lives Matter signs. And Main Street is kind of this like checkerboard, and everyone's kind of like flying their colors right now.
Mm.
And that's been really interesting because it's people who have to have relationships with each other.
Yeah.
Not abstract. It's not online. It's like, this is my house. And you don't just know me, back to my great grandparents and my kids. And
No doubt.
it's much more like intimate. And I actually really appreciate that a lot.
Hmm.
And it's
Yeah,
closer
you
to
can't
my
just go
ideal
shout
as
at
an
each other.
anarchist, to live in
Sorry.
it's closer to my ideal as an anarchist too, someone who doesn't want to be in this mass
Hmm.
society of
Right. But then how do they cope with that contradiction? I mean, how are you seeing people try to, are you seeing people trying to resolve it, or is it just festering?
I don't it's hard to say because I just
Yeah.
know very few people so far, but I think that the directness of the public conversation is good. You
What
know,
about election signs? Are you seeing, are there a lot of Trump signs? And have you ever seen a Biden lawn sign?
I saw the first one I've ever seen in the wild on a trip up to Spokane in a really like rich neighborhood.
A Biden lawn sign?
Yeah,
Or yeah,
there's a
okay.
lot of Trump flags,
And a lot of Trump flags.
but just as many in town as there are out
Yeah.
here in the country. And the thing I've seen that I really think is amazing is like I have a favorite. So I'm going to drive to the nearest Walmart, basically. There's a farmhouse that has a big banner out front that says "White silence is violence, Black Lives Matter," and it's just like that's vulnerable. You know, it's you're out in Confederate flag land, and just like to put that on your fence, I think
Yeah.
the scale is different, and that's like that's where you live, and you're saying that, and you're probably a white, you know, third generation farmer who has seen this and wants to, you know, stand up in the way you can and say something from the highway in between all of these, you know, blue lives and Trump flags. So
But
yeah,
somebody could just shoot at you as they're driving by, and
yeah,
you'd always be wondering. At least that's why I don't have bumper stickers on my car. I, I know how people can get in the moods people get in on the highway, and I
mhm,
mean, it's just the road rage possibilities, and
yeah,
uh,
yeah. And that's something that is a I was just thinking about that the other day is like growing up during the Bush years, the W Bush years, um, and being young and dumb, but like I feel like the potential for just like street level, just like take somebody's sign, whatever. I feel like the stakes are different on that too, just because of the level of kind of interpersonal violence that this far right element has introduced.
yeah.
I don't really want to snatch a flag off someone's truck.
When you know that they're probably armed with an AR-15 or
Yeah,
whatever, yeah,
exactly. So I think we have to fight on other terrain than
yeah.
you know, yeah.
Yeah, it's really I mean, it's like now you have protesters being killed on a regular basis at protests, which is
Mhm.
not necessarily the first time that's ever happened, but it's
Mhm.
certainly happening like on a very much more frequent basis. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm. I was you traveled across the U.S. in 2015 collecting interviews, and you did over 300 interviews. And just the idea of even going through them all and listening to them all, let alone actually doing something else with it beyond that. I mean, just the project of listening to all 300 interviews, just that alone must have been fascinating, not to mention perhaps tedious, and you must have been constantly like, oh, I should have said this, or I don't know if you do have that kind of experience a lot, but
Yeah. Well, just to clarify, so the trip in 2015 was like a 2.5 month kind of like special of the show. So the 300 are more the collective from the weekly show over all those years. And then there are 55 from summer of 2015. So it's more manageable. I'm reaching out to all those people and finding who will be re-interviewed. So I'm kind of starting with those folks to remember what they said, remember what I said, follow up. It's really interesting, thankfully. Especially like summer of 2015 was just such, you know, Peter Werby, who's producing this show right now. When
oh,
we,
and Peter, by the way, he says that in regards to our recent few sentences there, that you need to move to Detroit. There's no floods, no fires, no fascists.
I'll consider it. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I love
But
it
did
there. I love
you
it,
went to Detroit during your?
but yeah,
He was one of the folks you interviewed on your
yeah,
travel.
and he made a comment that was just kind of exactly what I'm looking for and going back to these. And he said he was talking about his experience in the movements of the 60s, you know, which is something I didn't get to experience. And he said regarding 2015, he said, I hope it's 1964 right now. And I wonder, you know, not that it was exactly the same, but, you know, everything that's happened since, we just have this constant escalation that I imagine feels like a more intense because it's mediated through like constant exposure through our screens version of the 60s. So finding the things like that makes it really fun for me to, I don't know about fun because it's pretty bleak too. You know, we're talking about rising up against police violence in 2015 and like here we are. And 5 years
Right.
that long in social movement years, but it also has felt like a very long 5 years for most of us, I think.
Definitely, because there was a lot of other things going on. I mean, an election and all sorts of climate catastrophes and a whole lot of other things happened in the intervening years between when Black Lives Matter was really much more prevalent in 2014, 2015, and that kind of like
Mhm.
ebbed, I guess, until recently in terms of the numbers of people on the streets around that
Mhm.
question of police violence. And
Yeah.
yeah.
But I think it's such a good lesson, just like the whole thrust of the show was always to figure out what was working, you know? And I think that Black Lives Matter is such a good example of what was
Hmm.
working, because while in the public sphere and in terms of like street protest, the movement seemed to ebb during that time. I mean, there was so much grassroots organizing happening and so many people who realized, you know, when they saw the uprising in Baltimore and when they saw Mike Brown laying in the street, like really started to churn. And it takes some time from most people don't see their first injustice and then like become an organizer, you know. And I think that all those activists and the way it's a decentralized network, just every little community, like all of these things were quietly happening. And now, you know, you lock people inside for 4 months and you can do anything.
Yeah,
People,
right.
you know?
People are ready for having some community. Yeah.
Yeah.
But talk more about that tactical question. That's, I mean, I think about that a lot too. And I think that was also really at the center of a lot of the interviews you were doing, is you're really focusing on a lot of questions about tactics and strategies. And that's really extremely relevant. And
Yeah.
I mean, so many people are putting, I mean, of course, we live in this society and so many people are putting their energy into the upcoming election, even knowing that, Biden is horrible. And, it's this kind of, there's a lot of talk about local elections and there's progressives winning office. But, it seems to me, and I'm pretty sure to you that so much social change actually that effectively doesn't happen through that particular avenue, and happens through the kinds of things that we're seeing today. And this kind of like when people have a meme or when there's like an idea in mind in terms of a broad idea of what we're trying to accomplish and how we're trying to accomplish it, and that seems to be kind of taking shape in various ways that I'm not sure if I can exactly name. But yeah, I want to talk about that. Would you talk tactics and
Yeah.
strategies?
Yeah. I think it's something I've been interested in mostly because I felt as a really idealistic, really young person getting involved that like we were about to win, you know? Like it's 2008, like, and then, you know, it's 2011 and it's Occupy and like we're going to change everything and we're going to win. And then realizing like, oh shit, we're not. And that's okay. But also kind of really believing in this like purity model that I think is really popular on the greater left, that like there has to be one thing. And, you know, I think anarchism as a collective really experiences that too. I think there's a lot of people who are like, if you aren't doing the thing that I think is right, which is usually either like militant insurrection or like learning perfect theory forever and making sure we all have perfect theory, then you're doing it wrong. And the more people I talk to and the more I learned about like history of social movements, the more it's clear that it's a variety of tactics that makes us win, whatever that means to you over time. So, you know, I talk to people who are doing alternative education projects and alternative media and trying to do some like deprogramming work, basically, which I think is really crucial right now with all the conspiracy thinking that is like in real political power and in our families and communities.
Mhm.
And then, you know, people doing direct action is really interesting to be out in that summer of 2015 because it was right before Standing Rock. And, you know, I was traveling through the Dakotas and meeting what's really interesting, I think, and I'm going to interview an activist I met there tomorrow again to talk to her. So it's before Standing Rock. But all of these tribal leaders, mostly Sioux, Lakota Sioux, the people who I was meeting, knew that this was coming. And I mean, there was a highly networked, highly organized scouting mission going on, basically watching to be like, are they going to break ground here or are they going to break ground there? And, like Standing Rock wasn't a coincidence or an accident. So, and just seeing the like duration of that movement and the kind of popularization for a lot of people, seeing a big successful direct action like that. And then people doing like legal work, working within the systems, doing advocacy and trying to block things in the courts, which, they all have their limitations, but
Right.
it's just been a real interesting journey to kind of collect all those pieces and see like what is useful about this and
how do they work in combination?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where else did you go? How many states did you get to in your travels?
I don't know. So I didn't get very far south, and I would love one day to do that. I feel a lot more equipped to engage where I'm from. And I think, the American South, especially as like just a white person from the Northwest and like from Montana and Idaho, to show up and be like, I want to understand the South in like a couple weeks is just like not useful for anyone. But so I started in Spokane, and I went through like Pasco, Portland, down the California kind of corridor to LA, Vegas, and then up through Utah, where there was a lot of fracking happening at the time, and met some anti-fracking folks, and then up through Denver, trying to put this all in order, through the Dakotas, actually through Yellowstone, back through the Dakotas, and then up into Canada, into Alberta, Calgary. I was thwarted by terrible weather in trying to go visit some water protectors, Indigenous folks over in BC. There was just like a literal tornado, and I was right above my grandparents' house, and I was like, I could not die in a tornado. So I came back, and then I did the second half not in a car and started in Detroit, went up through Toronto, Montreal, down through Vermont, went to Bread and Puppet, which was lovely. Right there. New York, Philly, Baltimore, down as far as Kentucky, Lexington, and then back. So,
covering a whole lot of ground.
But yeah, not all 50 by any means. So
no, and a lot of Canada in there too, which is very different history and sort of experiences with the state, and it's a really different society, isn't it? Mm-hmm. I mean, right now, obviously, to take a very current example, most people in Canada are getting $2,000 a month sent to them by the state. That makes things look very different than our situation here with 40 million people facing eviction.
Yeah, definitely. And I think on the flip side of that too, looking at the things that were really similar is like the state's treatment of Indigenous people, which was different but equally violent in both of those places, and like the ways that that's played out. It's nice. I think it's nice to get both, because I think Americans in general too tend to like really romanticize Canada and be like, oh, if we were just in Canada, everything would be beautiful. It's like, well.
And the Canadian elite can always point to the U.S. and say, look, things could be so much worse. They do that in Europe all the time too. Like, what, you don't like your social services? Look how bad it is in the U.S.
Yeah.
You should feel lucky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you're listening to Fifth Estate Live, which comes to you every Tuesday on various platforms, including the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance and KBOO Community Radio here in Portland, Oregon. You can find all the episodes archived in audio form at fifthestate.org, where you can also subscribe to the Fifth Estate print magazine. You ran an open mic in Spokane for quite a while. It's something I also did for many years in different places, and it's a fascinating process, I think, hosting an open mic. And I wonder if you have any particular insights into humanity that you gleaned from that experience, or just what people write about.
Yeah.
or what people do performance about. Because one of the things I found was that it's so completely different from what the record labels put out in terms of like, I mean, my open mics is always a mix of musicians and poets with an emphasis on musicians, but like the material that people were doing, that they were writing, it just bore no reflection to what you heard on the radio, and that to me was interesting. It was very consistent.
Yeah, that's interesting. That so ours were kind of the inverse, and it was a poets and musicians with an emphasis on poets and spoken word folks. So, I mean, I need to shout out my comrade Adrian, who co-founded that collective with me, and I often hosted, but he regularly featured. I'd say he's more the soul of the operation. He's a poet and a performer and musician, and just a really awesome. He's a queer Chicano activist who's spent so much of his life living in North Idaho, which that alone is just like rich with like stories. And so I just want to give him some love. But
yeah,
it was we founded the collective Love and Outrage with the specific idea of politicizing the poetry community more overtly and kind of poemifying the activist community, because both of us were straddling that line. And a lot of the people I've met who are the most effective organizers play music on the side or do some kind of art. I think just for basic sanity, it's really important. And so we wanted to try to fuse those worlds on purpose, and it was cool. And something I liked about it a lot, he's, I don't know how many years my senior, but significantly. And we ended up yielding a really intergenerational crowd. And that was really cool. Like, I think our print issue, probably the broadest range in age was like 14 would be our youngest published, up to like 80, So, and we're lucky that we were in a kind of broader social justice community that was like that. So I think that was really cool, because you have these like Vietnam vets who hate war so much giving kind of like personal testimony about that we need to topple the US empire. And then we have very young people, who are marginalized in a variety of ways, kind of just like giving their own really raw, like, that's something I notice about the younger people and the younger poets. It's like, it's like really just raw and
raw personal experience with trauma. Would you say is a overwhelming?
A lot of processing trauma, I think, and it was good to have a positive intergenerational space to do that, because I just think a lot of those young people and a lot of us in general don't have like queer elders, for example. And a lot of people of color in the inland Northwest often don't have a lot of, elders, like visible community who share their values. And it's
so the open mic then
for those old timers to see like, oh, the young people do care. Because I think there's always kind of this like, where are all the young people at our protest? And it's like, well, they're doing something different that you don't fully understand.
Yeah, but the open mic kind of formed a bit of a community in the town.
Yeah.
And one of the things you've also written about, and as far as it also relates to community in terms of your experience living in a group house, which was really interesting to me to read, because it's like one of those experiences that I don't know, very large numbers of young people have had the experience of living in a group house, but then I'd say in the vast majority of cases, they're doing it out of economic necessity, not necessarily because of like, sort of ideals. And then their experience either way can be all over the map, from very positive to very negative and everything in between. But it was really interesting to read some little analysis of that experience, which of course I think you may have entered into intentionally, or was it for economic reasons, or both?
I gotta be honest and say it's not a period of my life that I have the crispest memories of at this point.
Well, it's been a while too, and there may have been.
Yeah, but it kind of started out. So I was living with my sister, and we had been involved in a lot of like activist stuff together already for years, and found this house, and it was very cheap. So it was both economic and cultural, you know. I'd say it was definitely an intentional space, which is important. But it was also kind of like, yeah, we can fit one more. That's $50 less rent for everyone. So and it did continue after both of us moving out too. It's no longer active, but you know, we kind of, it was like kind of a dynastic thing of saying like, oh, okay, we have these other friends who want to move in. Let's keep this space. And you know, at that time, there was a really good DIY like network in that town, in Spokane. So it was just really cool to be part of that and have that kind of community. And you know, it's gross, but it's important. And yeah.
It can be much more special to that kind of community. From my experience in towns like Spokane, I guess it's because it's not just like you don't just walk down to the nearest pub and get exposed to that kind of culture, the nearest cafe or something. You have to create it, and it has to be more intentional, or it just doesn't really happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And such an overwhelming, it was just starting then, you know, Spokane is really gentrifying really quickly and is one of the most desirable real estate markets in the country, which doesn't bode well for anyone on the fringe. And
Very bad.
you know, and a lot of the cafes are run by evangelical Christians, and you know, just there's all kinds of forces against having that kind of radical community. But I think that also it's why the punk scene in Salt Lake City was so like, you know, if you have something to fight against, you know, you will find the people who want to.
Absolutely.
World.
And if in your travels you had gone to the South, you would have found a lot more of that too. The Bible Belt, it just is full of the best radicals, I think, from my experience.
Yeah.
They just react against all that, and then they're even more fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any poems of yours laying about that you might be able to deliver for us? I didn't ask you about this in advance, but I was especially, and I especially liked, I mean, a lot of it, but the one that was written as an assignment where they gave you a bunch of keywords. That was a really neat idea, and I thought I love that poem. But
let me find. If I can grab my laptop, I can.
Oh yeah, sure.
Oh geez, I didn't expect that at all.
I should have warned you in advance.
Okay, it's okay.
I don't prepare for these shows until like 2 hours before they're actually happening. So then,
I won't reveal too much about my process in the past, but with my show, but I may relate to that. Yeah. Just like furiously reading journal articles so that I know enough about nuclear production to ask someone about nuclear production, you know?
Yeah. Being able to ask good questions, luckily, is a lot easier than actually, having good answers to them.
Yes. I know. I'm making a special exception to be on the other side of the mic.
Thank you. And have you been writing anything in the past couple of years or during the pandemic?
You know, I'm working a little bit on a zine on the side that might be like poetic, but not explicitly poetry. The last poetry project I did with a friend of mine, and she basically was like, I want you to do half the book. So I just kind of was forced to, which I appreciate. But yeah, I've been so focused on this project and just kind of also survival, like mental survival. Just been like reading more of other people's stuff and kind of trying to just play music and teach myself how to just like chill as a person and not always be doing 12 things at once. So
because I mean, you've been doing podcasting and things related to basically things that you can do from your room at home, for a long time now, and also writing and poetry and putting together zines. All that is very potentially, sort of, you can be very isolated and do all those things, right? But
Mhm.
so I think in some ways, although a lot of artists have been terribly adversely affected by in terms of income, by the pandemic, the sort of project orientation of the artist and the sort of hermit tendencies to, are probably helpful psychologically for getting through this period.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the introversion and, I've also just really had to adapt the last few years. I got really sick a few years ago, and I have lupus, and now with
Ah,
the pandemic, it's like I already had really like ebb and flow energy and just like extra vulnerability, and now it's just like I should lean into being a hermit, and being online, and yeah, I like it. I mean, I'm not like trying to make light of this situation that we're in, but I think I saw a lot of other people kind of saying, especially introverts, being like,
hmm
being able to take a nap when I'm tired is pretty cool. So I'm hoping that that will radicalize people in some ways.
yeah. And
So,
slowing down, whether it's out of necessity or not. In this case, you have to in so many
mhm,
situations.
yeah. All right, I found one
Excellent.
if you want. Okay.
Yeah, great.
So this is from that 2015 book, and it's inspired by also short trip, and some work with Palestine solidarity, but also just, yeah.
Great.
So it's called Slingshot Riot Giant Harvest. And it opens with a quote from Wendell Berry. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. The train yard is poisoned, abandoned, a place desecrated by chemical trash, better left untouched. Desire to break something permeates, but everything here is already broken. Pieces of concrete that never got to be part of anything greater than themselves, dented, rusting metal barrels that don't have anything left to hold, and a decade's worth of broken bottle glass competing for ground with gravel. And yet, there are trees. Who knows what ruin they drink up through their roots, what unholy water flows below, and yet there are birds nesting. Every fence with a sign that reads no trespassing has a hole in it somewhere. Part the chain link teeth, hold them open for the others. Pick your way across that toxic floor in sandals, carry your own water. Watch your friend choose stone-side chunks of former something to load. Learn the way to pull your arm all the way back. Concentrate. Take aim at the waist and let fly. Across the ocean, it is nearly dawn in Nazareth. A small boy picks his way across a room of sleeping siblings and slips out the door. He watches the road, crosses it, pocketing stones along the way. He learns to pull back without shaking. The hatred too big for his body, he concentrates. He takes aim at the wall, and the noise as pebble meets concrete is too quiet to wake anyone. Every wall that high is topped with sharp teeth, with soldiers. No one will ever have to explain Goliath to him. Back at the train yard, pebbles fail to satisfy rage. Throw larger rocks at the barrels. Taste the gong noise as it ricochets between ear and jawbone. Lift then the barrels and bash them against the others, louder now, and yell and stomp as rust cuts into palm. Sweat in the heat before the harvest. Hum the song you learned at the demonstration. I am a sleeping giant. There is a riot in my bones. I am a sleeping giant. There is a riot in my bones. Remember, there are trees. Across the ocean, olives and almonds ancient. Take up your sore limbs and walk home as the world awakes. Wash your hands clean and wait.
Fantastic. Did you write that around the time that you went to Palestine?
No, I wrote it a ways after, at least a year after.
Mm,
Um, I wrote it after, actually, it's pretty direct. I was in Montreal with my sister and a friend. We're going to the Anarchist Theater Festival, which is an amazing annual event there that I highly recommend for everyone.
great.
And our friend just like took us to this train yard, which feels very home for us and kind of a gross post-industrial rail town. And
Oh, yeah.
yeah, we just brought a slingshot and we were just throwing shit at other shit, and it was really it's really healing to do. And um yeah, I think especially for women in general too, we don't get a lot of chance to like publicly express our rage, and it doesn't mean we don't have it. So
Yeah.
yeah, and just thinking about the kids that, you know, I met and stayed with and their families in the West Bank, and kind of like living right by the separation wall, and just trying to think about like what would that be like. So
Yeah.
yeah.
When you went to Palestine, I mean, you already knew a lot about what was going on there before you ever went there, yeah? I mean, it was something that you were not shocked like that, oh, it's an apartheid state. I mean, you
Yeah, not in the grand sense.
Mhm.
Like I definitely knew more than I think we know as like average Americans consuming the news. But it was only because, like, the reason I went with a group that's now called Eyewitness Palestine, and I have really mixed feelings about the whole um, enterprise, for lack of a better word. I think that they do
Right.
work as an organization, but basically, I was really caught in between. It was in 2012, during that time, that Israel began to bomb Gaza in earnest. There were local protests that were incredibly divisive, and lots of yelling and people threatening to push each other into the street. And I was kind of like, you know, this is deeper than I think it is, and maybe I want to learn more. And I was just confronted with so much contradictory information. It's so hard to try to talk to people who are either earnest, you know, supporters of the Israeli government, no matter what, and people who are like really militantly anti-Israel. And I was like, this can't all be true. Maybe I should just try to go. So I went, and it was only a 2.5 week trip, which is not nearly long enough to absorb. And it was jam packed with meeting different people and going to different towns and cities and seeing a lot of things, specifically related to the US role. So I did learn a lot during that time. And I kept doing work and kind of education and advocacy work with Palestine Solidarity. And it's still something I care a lot about. I just haven't been as active. Yeah.
Were there any particular insights from being on the ground that you were struck by that you didn't get from conversations or reading before going?
Yeah, I think just the infrastructure, like talking about the wall, people hear about like settlements, or even, you know, that there's a wall, and people hear this idea of like two states, one state. People in the US just get this very vague information, and we don't get a lot of imagery of like what it means when, if you have a farm in the West Bank, if you're Palestinian, your family's had that farm, and all of a sudden there's a checkpoint in between where you are growing your food and where you need to bring it to market. And depending on the day, you either do or don't get to go through that checkpoint. And there's like people with guns everywhere all the time. Just like seeing that infrastructure in person, I think humanize it in a way. I think that for Americans, even the most well-meaning Americans, like the value of human life in other places is like highly, highly devalued. And it's just like when that explosion in Beirut, you know, people are like, yeah, doesn't stuff explode all the time there? I don't know. Aren't people used to that? And that's just, I think that's real for all of us to some degree, despite our best efforts to not have it be real. So I think just really seeing the logistical, it's also just kind of how my brain works, is being like, oh, if I was here every day, what would I have to do? And just the incredible strain of having to just navigate the physical infrastructure really stuck with me, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing that really struck me was the how when a city is surrounded by checkpoints and people can't go out, and they know they can't go out. Like I think in Nablus, there's only 2 taxis that are allowed to leave the city, and everybody else with a private car or a taxi knows they can't leave the city, and so they don't try to leave the city. So like people can be hungry, and they need to leave, and they can't, and they don't, and so the hunger is invisible. It's so much of the hardship is not actually visible, which is yeah. That's I if there was one thing that I particularly came away with from my visit, it was the sort of invisibility of so much suffering,
Mhm.
even though so much of it is also very visible. I mean, you see the people, the soldiers with the guns, you see the checkpoints, you see the wall, and then you see all that, and you're only seeing the tip of the iceberg.
Mhm. Yeah.
Mm. Would you do another poem for us? Do you have another one?
Yeah.
Am I putting you on the spot with the poetry too much?
No.
I mean that one. I mean that last one was great, but that one about Spokane. I mean, there was that line about the closet and the suitcase in the closet. That I mean, a great poem often has that some line in it that just really just has pulls on those heartstrings, and that sure got me. I mean, it was.
I'll have to find it. That's funny because I'm like, which one? What is that?
I know. Yeah, it's only when other people
Uh-huh.
read your stuff that it sort of yeah.
It's cool because it's like, hmm.
But we'll do another station break because we should do
Sure,
that
yeah.
every
Well,
couple. You're listening to Fifth Estate Live, which comes to you every Tuesday on various platforms, including the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance and Cebu Community Radio. You can find all the episodes archived in audio form at fifthestate.org, where you can also subscribe to the Fifth Estate, an amazing cover by Seth DeBachman. I haven't read any of the articles other than the one I wrote, but it's going to be good.
yeah. Can't find this suitcase situation. So
Oh yeah. Well, it's on your website, but
no, that's
that doesn't make it easy to find
yeah.
necessarily. I know how it is.
That's so funny.
Yeah. I have many of my songs in alphabetical order, except for the ones that I didn't put in there, like anything I've written in the past 5 years. So it's not a very helpful archive when it's
Yeah.
missing. Like,
It's a work in progress, right?
yeah, yeah. Most websites are a work in progress.
Yeah. Is it the
Yeah.
bus one?
The bus one. It was one where you had to use all these different words.
Oh my gosh. That's
I love that assignment. I mean, I think,
I'll
I've personally written some of my best stuff on those kind of weird assignments.
this is like the only straightforward love poem I've ever written, and I'm gonna read it to a bunch of people.
Oh, good, good. Is that what you'd call that one? A straightforward love poem? It's such a good love poem, but it's also about Spokane.
It is, yeah. I guess that is true. Well, so yeah, this is from um I was working as a volunteer with a art collective called Laboratory that does interactive art and brings interactive artists from all over the place. So it was a really cool opportunity to just be exposed to smart tech people who care about art, which is a cool intersection. So Carrie Wang used a database of archival postcards from Spokane and kind of tagged them with voice recognition software. So this was to be performed in front of a screen that was listening to all of these poets. A bunch of poets participated reading the poems, and she provided a list of trigger words that would make the postcards appear. So we would be kind of
Cool.
like accompanied. And then there were some, so like the word fuzzy is in there, the word dream, and the word surreal would act upon the image that was there. So it would fuzz out, it would glitch, It was
I
a cool
like it.
project. So
Yeah.
that's the full context. So I guess, yeah, shout out to Spokane people. So it is actually untitled, but it's from her project, Postcards from Spokane. I remember you taking the bus from the airport, coming home to me to my place on Riverside Avenue, the San Marco, a full day or two before anyone else knew you were in the city at all. The nature of us, stolen time, coffee in bed, that was the life. Did I dream that you took us to the roof of the USA Pavilion at night? I remember laying down on the white concrete and pine needles, staring up at the net, willing you to hold my hand. My first psychic love, we packed snacks and our cameras and tried to walk the border of Spokane in a day. We made it 20 miles. I always loved seeing our photos side by side, how we could see the same thing so differently. Too young for tired feet, too animal to mind scratched up legs. We smoked a blunt and found bats by the waterfall at the Palisades. Every place we found was surely new because we, chosen and golden, had discovered it. How far did we walk those summers? We had sex in the Rose Garden at Manitou Park the last weekend before school started. Was that a dream too? Memories grew fuzzy, untrustworthy, surreal when we were apart. Then together, apart, together, and parted by miles, but me still in a forest of snapshots. I'd sigh my way past your old house. I'd sit under the bridge where the spray mists up into lonely rainbows. I'd wonder how much nostalgia I could bear. You never got to see my place on Main Street, did you? Even now, I bet I could summon you to me with bewitching little postcards, a psychic code to crack, an invitation to make this scrap of a city our world again.
That's so gorgeous.
Thank you. The bear, I just have to say how much nostalgia I could bear. I was really proud of because I knew that was a picture of a bear. And it's just a dad joke written into the poem.
So. Oh, great. Good.
Just want to acknowledge the dad joke.
The dad joke. And I imagine that, I mean, I don't know how, if you're avoiding the news or if you're immersed in it, but I imagine you're paying some attention to a lot of developments in the country and in the world. And I just, I have to ask people about their predictions for the future, even though it's things are changing on a daily basis. Like the next few weeks and the next few months are the two futures I'm particularly interested in.
Yeah. I mean, I really hesitate to make big predictions, but I guess I could say the thing that I'm most paying attention to and concerned about that gives me a not good outlook on the immediate and far future is the, for lack of a better term, like the reality problem in American politics. And like for people who are paying attention to that, like Trump openly embracing, he's been winking at them for years, but the QAnon folks, if people want to go down a really disturbing rabbit hole, there's no shortage of information on that conspiracy. And just that conspiracy thinking in general, it's frustrating to me because it's like, you're so close. Like the rich are in a disproportionate amount of control. They are corrupt and sinister, but that doesn't mean that they are literal demons running a child sex trafficking operation. That's the part where I'm like, you could have just stopped and joined this like fight against, hegemonic power. And the way it dovetails with anti-Semitic conspiracy is really upsetting. We have this like fascist movement that now really has like, I feel like a lot of fascism has like an occult angle to it. A lot of it has, and a lot of that's usually really tied up in anti-Semitism. And just to see that like millions of Americans are becoming deeply engaged in that occultism, and we don't have the tools, especially the people who are most vulnerable to it, who I think are kind of like baby boomers who are on the internet, really don't have the tools of like critical media analysis or anything like that. And we can't use those traditional tools. So all that to say, I'm really concerned about that. I don't know how to call the presidential election. I think even though Biden is deeply problematic and uninspiring, I think that people hate Trump enough that they'll fall in line and just kind of hold their nose and do it. But I also don't think there's any evidence to support the idea that Donald Trump will just leave. If he
right. Like, and do you think that
12 more years at his rally and laughing, like, I just don't think that we should assume that there's just no evidence that shows that this is a person who cares about like law or precedent or anything. It's like such a nihilist that it's like, why would he leave?
Yeah, and what gives you the impression, like, is it from sort of overview of different forms of media or personal experiences in Eastern Washington, or what gives you the impression that Trump is hated enough that he probably won't win? I mean, of course, there's the polls, but the polls were wrong 4 years ago.
Yeah. I think that it reveals a lot that the Republicans are focused so much on voter suppression, because it's like, the majority, like the new majority of Americans are not people who are feel represented by far right politics. And that isn't to say that we are well represented by the Democratic Party, because they're vile also, but like just demographically, just, racially, I think we've seen the organizing power of Black women, of, of trans people, of Black trans women, like the most marginalized in the current system. We've seen the power that these people wield. And I like to think I'm in kind of a social justicey bubble, that they're being listened to more. And I just think if everyone had access to just throw their vote in the box, that there would be no question. And I think that's why the right is like flailing so much and is so violent, and like, because they're dying out. And while they're a young, fascists, and there's been a lot of recruitment, I just think that they're freaked out.
And so all the voter suppression stuff, and then they don't necessarily need to actually win outright. But of course, they didn't need to win outright last time.
Yeah. And I hesitate because it's like, it's just really not my area of expertise either, and
we're all armchair virologists and armchair pundits, I think, at this point. No,
it's just too much like sports for me to get into it. People are like,
yeah.
oh, this poll says this. I'm like, I
Yeah.
don't have any money on this game. Like, I don't.
Are you seeing much evidence of mutual aid activities going on in little towns in Eastern Washington?
Yeah. Actually, when there's a lot from people who both define it that way and people who are doing it without knowing that they're doing mutual aid. When the pandemic first really hit and lockdown first started, I was part of an effort called Spokane County Mutual Aid with a lot of other folks. And it was really cool in that it was truly grassroots, and it was people who, a lot of us knew each other from doing other work, but then it was just people who found us. And we're like, I wanted to do something. It was on the Mutual Aid Hub website, which I'm very glad that smart programmer people created that infrastructure, because it was really great to just see all over the country you could find stuff. So we were focusing on grocery delivery, grocery purchase, kind of things like that. And then like small cash assistance, just kind of a no questions asked. And that felt really important. It kind of, when the protests kicked off, a lot of the people involved in the organizing were involved in that, which I think is good, and I moved. But
Makes
I think
sense.
that infrastructure is going to be really useful and something we really need.
That's good to know about the Mutual Aid Hub website. I hadn't heard of it.
I think it's just mutualaidhub.com.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure if you just Google it, there's a map, and yeah.
Nice.
Really great. They were running calls. You could like learn from organizers around the country who were doing similar things. And it's great. So it was like farm towns in Iowa, and then like one building in Manhattan, on the same call, where they're like, we have a network of 400 people in this building. And then, kind of the whole spectrum. So yeah.
Excellent. Taylor Roseweeds, thanks so much for joining me for the hour. It's been a pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for asking good questions and making it easy to be on the other side.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know some people who are used to doing interviews just can't stand being interviewed. Yeah.
I can do
it. It wasn't too painful. Okay, good. Good. Oh, and Peter mentions next week. I think it's good to have the producer who's actually able to comment there. That's a new innovation. But yeah, next week we'll be talking to Franklin Lopez from Sub Media. Yeah, thanks so much, Taylor.
Yeah, thank you.
And thanks for everybody tuning in. And once again, yes, as Peter just mentioned, there on Twitch next week on Tuesday next week, Fifth Estate Live we'll be talking to Franklin Lopez from Sub Media, who I think interviewed me like 20 years ago, and I can't remember when the last time I saw him was, but I'm looking forward to talking to him. Actually, it was Montreal a few 6 years ago in Montreal. I think it was when I last saw Franklin. But anyway, thanks everybody for tuning in to this discussion with Taylor Roseweeds for Fifth Estate Live, which you can hear every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, KBOO, Community Radio, and elsewhere. You'll find all the Fifth Estate Live episodes at fifthestate.org, where you can also subscribe to the physical magazine. You can find these interviews and my other interviews archived in various places in the Discussions with David playlist at youtube.com/drovix and in audio form at soundcloud.com/davidrovix, at patreon.com/davidrovix, where you can also support my broadcasting efforts and check out lots of other content, or if you look for This Week with David Rovix on any podcasting platform. If you're somewhere in the region of Portland, Oregon, please go to artistsforrentcontrol.org and sign up for text notifications to be part of Portland Emergency Eviction Response to help us mobilize against the coming waves of evictions. I've got a crowdfunder for an album project going too, also known as a musician and audio engineer employment scheme. You can check that out at davidrovix.com/pandemic sessions. Remember, don't pay the rent and don't be afraid of your neighbors. Mutual aid will get us through. See you soon. Bye for